Thank you very much, Rebecca. One of the big misconceptions about the new feminism, I think, is that it's a war on men. You hear this argument all the time. You actually hear it from both sides of the discussion. You hear it from the critics of the new feminism who say this is an attack on blokes and blokish values and it's really unfair. And you hear it from the proponents of the new feminism as well, who say we've taken the war to the patriarchy, we're finally taking men down a peg or two, and it's about time we did. Both sides in the discussion about the feminism that has arisen over the past few years with great intensity seem to agree that it is a war against men. And you hear this argument most often from men's rights activists. These are the saddest people in the whole world. They live on the internet. They spend their whole day crying in discussion forums. And they blame feminism, and actually women really, for all the problems in their lives. The reason they can't get a girlfriend is because feminism has turned all the women into lesbians and bitches, and therefore they can't get a girlfriend. It's not their fault. The reason they can't get a job is because feminism has entirely feminized the workplace, and men are unemployable and have to just skulk the streets at night and all that kind of stuff. Really, that's where you hear it most, the most explicit idea that the new feminism is a war on men. I think it's really wrong to see the new feminism as a war on men, because I think, if anything, it is a war on women. The new feminism fundamentally and explicitly calls into question the ability of women to negotiate public life without assistance. It questions not so much male privilege as female autonomy and female capacity. It might take the piss out of men, does that all the time, loves doing that, but it does down women, and it does them down in a very profound way. And one of the great ironies of the new feminism, something that I've been thinking about in recent months, is the only time you really hear open contempt for women in the 21st century, which is a pretty PC, right-on, equal century, the only time you hear open contempt for women is from feminists. I was thinking about this recently. I come from a family of unreconstructed men. Pretty much every man in my family works in the building trade. They all have respectable jobs, unlike me. They read the tabloids, they drink beer, they watch football. I never hear them say contemptuous things about women, really contemptuous things. The only time I hear that is when I am in a public debate with a feminist, on the radio or on the TV or somewhere else. That's the only time I hear a genuine questioning of women's ability to be the same as men. So you see it in their phrases, in the phrases that are used by the new feminists. One of their favorite phrases is internalized misogyny. The idea that women have internalized self-hatred. They've been brainwashed by the culture around them. The reason they pick the careers they pick, and the reason they pick the university subjects they do, is because they've been brainwashed to think that's what they, as women, ought to do. Or they hate their bodies. Apparently all women hate their bodies because they walk down the street, they see adverts, they see magazine covers, and they collapse. They can't cope with the image. They become consumed by self-hatred, internalized misogyny. In other words, they are malleable, fickle creatures. They don't know their own minds. If that sounds familiar, that's because that was the prejudice of the Victorian era. Women do not know their own minds. They need guidance. Now we hear the same from the new feminists, but it's dolled up in the pseudo-academic language of internalized misogyny. You also hear the new feminists talk about women's fragile self-esteem. The reason a lot of these new feminists want to censor pornography, for example, or page 3 in The Sun, which has a naked woman on it, or used to before the feminists got rid of it. The reason they want to censor all these dangerous images is because, quote, this is what one of the campaigners say, they damage women and girls' self-esteem. Notice how they always put women and girls together, conflating these two entirely different categories of human being because they love to infantilize women. They see no difference between a 30-year-old woman who is autonomous and a 7-year-old girl who isn't. To them, they're all the same. And this idea that images, public life itself, needs to be controlled and curtailed in order to protect women's weak, fragile self-esteem explicitly suggests that they are less capable of negotiating the public sphere than men. They are not capable of seeing vulgar, horrible images without completely freaking out and having a nervous breakdown. You also see the new feminist war on women in their discussion about street harassment, which they're obsessed with. And on the surface, it looks like a war on men. They moan about the fact that some men still whistle at women. They catcall. Some of them even say, "Hello, darling." I mean, can you believe that? They have this idea that the streets are dangerous. It's really risky for women to go out. Even that is not a war on men. Even that is part of a war on women. Because what that suggests is that women cannot walk down the street, ideally without a chaperone, without someone to guard them from all the gruff language and all the horrible images and all the men saying, "Hello, darling, you look nice today." That too suggests that women are incapable of negotiating public life. You also see the new feminist contempt for women in their activities on campus, where they are creating safe spaces, women-only spaces, in which you can't say horrible things or supposedly sexist things or use coarse language. Some feminist students are now calling for trigger warnings on books. They think classic works of literature which mention, for example, rape or abuse or some other horrible thing should come with a trigger warning, and they say that primarily as a means of protecting female students who may have been through some of these experiences or who might just not want to read about them. They couldn't possibly read these books. They have to be warned in advance. If that sounds familiar, some of you may recall the 1960 court case in London into Lady Chatterley's Lover, D.H. Lawrence's novel, and one of the lawyers who wanted to keep the novel wanted to keep it banned, famously said, "Would you let your wife or your servant read this book?" In other words, it's fine for us men to read it. We're autonomous, we have brains, but women and servants, we couldn't let them read this filthy pornography. The same argument is made today by feminists in relation to female students. We couldn't possibly let them read these classic works of literature which mention sex or abuse or rape. And you also see the war on women element of the new feminism in all the discussion about how we have to remake the public sphere in order to make it more amenable to women. We're always hearing that the work sphere, the educational sphere, all elements of the public sphere, politics, need to be basically dumbed down, made less male, less gruff. We need to remove the blokiness from politics, as even Tony Bloody Abbott is saying these days, in order to make women feel more comfortable and welcome. What this really means, this idea that it should be politics and everything else should be less male, is that it should be less demanding, more consensual, softer, in order that women will feel at home. An extraordinarily patronizing idea to anyone, which I'm sure is everyone, who knows women who are not remotely consensual and in fact can be very argumentative and combative and all those things that men are as well. Meanwhile, if you look at new feminist books, there's a whole welter of new feminist books with titles like How to Be a Woman, Do It Like a Woman, A Book for Her, these awful, terrible dirges, which are kind of half self-help, half sassy, broad, a little bit of misery memoir thrown in, these really terrible books which have taken the publishing world by storm. If you read these, some of them are explicitly contemptuous of women. They devote a lot of their time and space to slagging off women, particularly women who shave, or who preen themselves too much, or who have plastic surgery. These women are really sneered at. They're looked down upon as having been brainwashed by porno culture, brainwashed by pop culture. They're stupid, they're vulgar, they don't know their own minds. That thing that was said about women 150 years ago is now said again by feminists. So I think the new feminism is actually a war on women, not a war on men. It represents, in my mind, a reversal of the enormous, wonderful gains that have been made for womankind over the past 150 or 200 years. The fact that women got the right to vote, the right to work, were seen as equal, autonomous, free-willed, the same as men, effectively. Now they are increasingly presented as fragile, threatened, unsafe, lacking free will, fundamentally unable to work out for themselves what's best in their lives. We're really rehabilitating an old Victorian view of women. All these things that the new feminists are saying were said by the Victorians 150 years ago. Even the safe streets stuff, the idea that the streets are full of harassers and vulgar men with gruff words, that was a favourite topic of the Victorians. The Ladies' magazine in the late 1800s started a campaign called Protection of Women, which was about making the streets safe for women who were seen as being at mortal threat, particularly from working class men using swear words and so on. Of course, in the Victorian era, it was also assumed that women couldn't go to university. No way. It was way too dangerous. Lots of strange ideas. That would freak them out. Same argument is made again today. And women couldn't see particular images. They would faint. They'd need their smelling salts. Those arguments are coming back too under the guise of the new feminism. So I would say, all these pathetic men's rights activists who give us blokes a bad name, they're completely wrong. This is not a war on men. This is a war on women. The new feminism is a problem, not because it does men down, but because it does women down, and it unwinds all those wonderful leaps forward that humanity has made over the past 2 centuries. But even that, I think, is not the full story, and I just want to end by just suggesting that there's even more to it than that. Because I think the new feminism most openly undermines and most explicitly calls into question the ability of women to run their lives as they see fit. But it also more fundamentally represents an attack on human liberal values, on modern Enlightenment values. I think the new feminism is in many ways at the cutting edge of the new misanthropy. It calls into question the values of the Enlightenment itself. And it does this in many ways. For example, the ideal of knowledge, the idea that it's good to know things, it's good to understand the world, it's good to be rational, it's good to be scientific. For the past 30 years or so, that idea has been called into question on campuses by feminists, by gender studies activists who say that science is too male-dominated, it's too phallic, it's sexist, it represents the rape of nature, knowledge itself is a questionable idea. The idea of politics, democracy, is called into question by the new feminism, which says politics is too combative, too conflictual, there's too much scary, hairy debate, we need more consensus, we need to flatten it all out, we need to be in agreement. Even the ideal of democracy, the lifeblood of which is tension and conflict, is called into question under the guise of the new feminism. Justice is being undermined by new feminist ideas. The idea that we shouldn't cross-examine people too harshly because their self-esteem might be damaged. The introduction of kangaroo courts on campus to try men accused of rape. In various ways, under the guise of the new feminism, justice is also being called into question. Knowledge, democracy, justice, liberty, the core values of the enlightened period are being undermined by the new feminism. But this is not a cabal of evil feminists who are doing this. This is not a collection of crazy, high-heeled women who have set out to say, we're going to destroy the Enlightenment. Society itself has lost faith in the Enlightenment. And the new feminism is best seen as the clearest manifestation of that, the clearest expression of that in 2015. And in that sense, I think the new feminism should be seen alongside environmentalism, alongside multiculturalism, alongside all these other supposedly progressive ideas, which actually represent an attack on progressive ideas and an attack on enlightened ideas. The new feminism should be seen as another glossy, pseudo-progressive idea that has been embraced by the elites because they've lost faith in the values of the Enlightenment, in what were traditionally seen as masculine values, but what I think we should see as human liberal values. The very final point I want to make is I would not make such a neat distinction between the old feminism and the new feminism. I don't think we had this wonderful second-wave feminism in the 60s and 70s, which was great, and now we have this horrible crap feminism, which is awful. I think there's more of a connection between these two things. And the worst thing that the second wave of feminism under Germaine Greer and others did was to promote the idea that the personal is political, which both exploded the whole idea of identity politics, which is the bane of our era, and which open the private sphere to more and more intervention, because if the personal is political, then it should be policed like everything else. This is the problem with the feminism that we live under today. It's riven with identity politics, it is authoritarian and interventionist, and in many ways that is the logic of the second wave feminism that we saw in the 60s and 70s. Thank you.